This is Tokens. I'm Lacey Camp. If you're a regular listener to our podcast, you know that the question of human flourishing is one we often raise. That, of course, in turn raises the question of what flourishing actually looks like. Or it raises the question about the factors, habits, and tendencies that inhibit or stand in the way to flourishing.
I think the Enneagram helps a lot with making space for creative dialogue that could ultimately move us forward.
That's Suzanne Stabile, author and master teacher of the personality tool known as the Enneagram. The Enneagram is one of those things in the popular zeitgeist right now in many circles. You can hardly go to a party, at least here in Nashville, without somebody bringing it up, or you may find it hard to work among folks without somebody bringing up somebody's Enneagram number. This personality tool, based around 9 personality types, has reached meme level, and I often find myself suspicious of trends and fads and memes. But it turns out the recent fad is not actually new at all.
The Enneagram is several thousand years old. It has been found in every faith belief, and that means that it's been found all over the world.
At its most basic, the Enneagram posits that there are 9 personality types that people have. But today, we're intentionally not going into each of those 9 types. Rather, we're going to take a larger view. The intention here is that before you start throwing around labels on yourself or others, you understand the why of the Enneagram, how it aids in human flourishing. I have myself succumbed to a degree to the Enneagram fad, started a number of years ago, but it's helped me gain some important wisdom about how to be a better husband, dad, friend, coworker, because, among other things, it has taught me a valuable lesson, that we don't all experience the world in the same way.
The reality is that the Enneagram is about 9 ways of seeing. I teach people who they're not. I don't teach people who they are. I teach people about the covering, about the personality that they started to put on in childhood to make their way in the world. And there are transformational opportunities where you can, through life, recognize that you don't need to be protected in that exact way anymore, and you can allow that layer of your Enneagram personality to fall away.
Today, whether you know anything about the Enneagram or not, and whether you ever want to know anything more about the Enneagram or not, this conversation with Suzanne is ultimately about wisdom. Wisdom that helps people make sense of themselves and others by peeling back layers of motivation, fear, and hubris. All this coming right up. Suzanne Stabile is an author, speaker, and teacher whose work as an Enneagram master teacher has earned her international acclaim. She's taught at universities, churches, and conferences all across the U.S. and abroad. Her books include The Road Back to You, written with Token Show alum Ian Cron, The Path Between Us, and now her most recent, The Journey Toward Wholeness, Enneagram Wisdom for Stress, Balance, and Transformation. She's also a former women's basketball coach at SMU, currently lives in Dallas with her husband Joseph, mother of 4 grown children, and grams to 9 grandchildren. So welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you very much. It's a gift for me to be with you.
Yes, a delight to get to have you with us. And, you were, as I mentioned to you in our kind of pre-show chat, you were my first real introduction to the Enneagram. It just kind of opened up my vision of seeing the ways people relate to each other, and you taught me how to argue with my wife.
I always try to find a way to keep men who are new to the Enneagram in the room, because generally they're there because somebody made them come, or they're there because they were told it would help them in some meaningful way with relationships. And I always say at the opening of a big event that anybody who wants to leave at noon can. and that we'll be happy to refund their money. And we've only done it one time in all the
Huh.
years. And I think it's because people really are very intrigued by themselves.
Hmm.
And, you know, I'm married to a Methodist pastor, and I grew up United Methodist. But I've come to believe that even though I'm not a scripture scholar, I do believe that if I ever, in the reality of whatever is beyond this reality that we can name, if I ever encounter Paul, I'm going to be able to say, you know how you ask that question all the time, why do I do the very things I don't want to do? Well, I know why.
I'm sure that he will appreciate hearing that from you. Yes.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but
No,
well,
that was definitely intended as satire.
good.
Yeah.
I'm glad we're on the same page about that.
I'm going to ask you to describe briefly for those who don't know what the Enneagram is, that in just a moment. But first, before we get to that, I think that one of the things that introduction did for me, and then the ongoing reading and studying I've done about the Enneagram, one of the major gifts it's been to me is to disabuse me of the notion that everybody experiences the world in the same way.
Right.
And to realize, oh, wait a second, other people don't have the same emotional response or inner workings or inner thoughts about the very same experiences that I might have. Mm-hmm. And it's a very liberating sort of openness to realize, hey, we're different. And that can then, I think, diffuse perhaps some of the emotional weight we unnecessarily put on other people's reactions when we realize, oh, well, they're just experiencing it differently than I am. But do you think that's a fair thing? Is that a common sort of response to the Enneagram?
Yeah, you know, the reality is that the Enneagram is about 9 ways of seeing. And everybody falls in one of those 9 ways, which is astonishing in itself. And it has to do with how you take in information, how you process that information, and then what you do with it. And it's just not the same for everybody. And I work some in the recovery community using the Enneagram. And I think one of the things that I've learned from them that is perhaps among the most important is that every expectation is resentment waiting to happen. And until we understand that the person that we love most in the world, the person right next to us, is not taking in information and processing it in the same way that we are, then that changes the playing field for everybody.
Right.
And if that could be met with curiosity rather than judgment, then I am convinced that we could do far greater than we think we can.
Yeah. Well, that whole notion of curiosity rather than judgment has been immensely helpful to me as well, in that I'm thinking back, for example, to a couple of years ago, Christy Bragg, who manages Token Show, I had popped off about something that had happened to one of our staff members and said, why did this happen, and blah, blah, blah. And she sent me a text. She said, can we talk on the phone? And I said, yeah. And so she said, Lee, it might be helpful if you simply were to say, can you tell me more about this, and assume there might be things you don't know, rather than assuming you understand. Understand.
Yeah.
And so that sort of curiosity rather than judgment, that's a terribly helpful practice, I think.
I think so too. And I don't think it's our habit. And it's not mirrored for us much. You know, we are now, in fact, mired in lining up in one line or another based on judgment, sometimes with a total lack of curiosity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For those who are not familiar with the Enneagram, any kind of, you mentioned the 9 big ways that people fall into experiencing the world, but other big picture things you might want to describe for those who are completely new to this particular conversation?
I think the 4 or 5 things I would say are these. The Enneagram is several thousand years old. It has been found in every faith belief, and that means that it's been found all over the world. Nothing was published about the Enneagram until the 1970s. And prior to that, it was oral tradition, which I still think is the best. I much prefer to teach orally. And in the days before the 1950s, spiritual teachers or wisdom people would teach the Enneagram to a disciple or a follower, and the only number they would teach you is your own. Because, of course, you really can't do anything about anybody but yourself. And so what I was looking for coming out of a pretty safe container in childhood and a product of the 60s, I graduated from high school in 1969. And I wanted to make the world more compassionate. Whatever I did, I wanted it to add compassion. And so when I had the opportunity to learn the Enneagram from Father Richard Rohr 30 plus years ago, I believed that I had landed in a place that spoke my inner language. And he thought the same thing. And so he asked me to study it for 5 years before I talked about it. And that was quite a challenge. And I think that gave me a broad enough foundation to be able to see its value and to be able to see that it's not the end all be all of anything. And so when people ask me what's dangerous about the Enneagram, my answer is that you take it to be more than it is. It's just one spiritual wisdom tool. Or if spirituality and that language isn't comfortable for you, it's just one wisdom tool. And, I'm kind of for getting wisdom wherever I can. I think life's pretty challenging. And if you add it to other practices that you have and people you read and belief systems that you find to be intriguing or supportive of your way of being in the world, then you have one more way of maybe living better and doing better.
You mentioned recovery world, and I've heard friends in the recovery world, one of their lines they'll often use is take what you can use and leave the rest. And I find that helpful with regard to the Enneagram as well.
Yeah. And I think the line that I was going to talk about that I pulled from working in the recovery community is that every expectation is resentment waiting to happen. And the reality is if you don't understand difference and the difference in how we see, then you have expectations of other people that they can't meet.
Right.
Even if they wanted to, they can't.
Yeah.
And then resentment builds and grows and builds and grows. And I think the Enneagram helps a lot with making space for creative dialogue that could ultimately move us forward.
One of the big categories or things that gets discussed in the basic Enneagram types is that each one has a major sin. So first, help us get beyond potentially the kind of moralistic types of revulsion that some people might experience of that kind of language, and kind of describe for us the ways in which you see that operating.
Well, first of all, I don't use sin. I use passion. I've met too many people who have been hurt too deeply by the use of the word sin from people in authority. And so my definition of sin as a Christian is missing the mark. And passion is helpful. So we can't do every number. So how about we'll do yours and mine?
Okay.
The passion for mine.
You're gonna out me. You're gonna out me on what I.
Well, I don't have to.
Yeah,
I'm
happy. I've talked about it before. Yeah.
Okay, all right. I'm a 2 on the Enneagram, and my passion is pride. So first of all, the Enneagram definition of pride is not the cultural definition of pride, and so that's the first hurdle that people would need good Enneagram teaching to get beyond. And the Enneagram definition of pride is the inability or unwillingness to acknowledge one's own needs and suffering while tending to the needs of someone else. So 2s on the Enneagram are the helper or the giver. And we can either give altruistically or we can give manipulatively. And because of this passion and the fact that we can read other people's needs and kind of do the giving even before they ask at times. We begin to believe that we're independent, which relationally is a significant problem because it means that interdependence is off the table. And in fact, we're not independent. We desperately need other people to need us because we don't feel like we have value if we're not needed. So that's a tiny little piece of a bigger picture. So I, as you said, have 4 children. They're all married. I have 9 grandchildren. I'm married to a pastor of the First United Methodist Church in Dallas, Texas, which is a flagship Methodist church. And there are people everywhere in my world, everywhere. And my children all went away to school and all came back. So all my children and their spouses and all my grandchildren are here. There are 19 of us. So if I give in to my Enneagram number in its average or below average way of being in the world, then I take care of other people and I don't have enough left to take care of the people I care of the most or of myself. So it's actually a very holistic understanding of a way of being in the world. And the idea that it's reductive is simply formed from a place of not knowing what it is. Because it's actually quite expansive.
Yeah.
And it's not a belief system that replaces anything. It's just its own wisdom.
Yeah.
You want to hear about you, or you want to move on?
Let's hear it. Let's see, describe how I experience things.
Okay.
Short note here. I've come to understand that I am a type 1 on the Enneagram, also labeled with a label I don't like, the perfectionist. But maybe a more helpful label often used is the label reformer. Still, I don't know. That sounds a bit grandiose. But anyway, I'm a type 1.
Well, first of all, your passion is anger. And I want to say that if I was a 1 on the Enneagram, I would be angry. And I would be angry because you, as a 1, have a critic that keeps up with everything you do. And for many 1s, it's an audible voice that you hear. Nobody else hears the voice that you're hearing, which is, makes you a little bit different than me. And I suppose...
Can I share something, interrupt you just a second about this? So when that first time I heard this description of the Enneagram from you, and you started describing, well, a 1 thinks this way, and I'm making my notes. I'm thinking yes, and would do this, and I think yes, and does this, and I say yes, and they do this, and I think, well, I would do that, but I wouldn't quite do it exactly like that. I would do it like this, which is the better way.
There you go.
And so this long list, and then you said, but the way you know you're a 1 is if you have the voice in your head. And my immediate internal response was, doesn't everyone have the voice in their head? So to realize that no, the other people don't have this voice in their head, yeah you're right. It does kind of make you mad. It's like, why do I have to carry around this constant inner critic?
Exactly. But because you have the critic, actually, the cultural definition of anger is not what fits your passion either. Resentment fits your passion. And the reason for that is that you turn all anger in on yourself first. And it comes out as resentment.
Yeah, that's true.
And my question would be, if I was being critiqued all day, every day, by a voice that nobody else hears, and we are convinced that our second oldest grandson is a 1 on the Enneagram, and I've known it quietly since he was 5 or 6. And literally, as an 8-year-old, he said to his dad, "Do you hear voices that other people don't hear?" And his dad said, "Well, no, I don't. Do you?" And he said, "Yeah." And his dad said, "Well, what do the voices say?" And he said, "Well, I don't want to tell you. They're not very nice." So, I could go off on a whole thing about Enneagram wisdom and education. Little kids who are 1s don't think it's okay to erase, so they start over. And then when they start over all the time, they don't finish their work, and then they miss recess. It's just helpful. And I don't defend the Enneagram to anybody. It's if this is great for you, good.
Yeah.
And if it's not, okay. And I just say to people, it's just true.
Yeah.
It's just true.
Yeah. And I appreciate what you're saying about avoiding the use of the language of sin, because that can just simply miscommunicate the wisdom that you're trying to point to here. But this notion that there are, and that's my understanding, even with going back to the catalog of the 7 deadly sins, we recently did an interview with Rebecca DeYoung from Calvin, and who has a book on the 7 deadly sins, or as she calls them, the 7 capital vices, which is the more traditional language. And she says it goes back to the Desert Fathers and Mothers who were trying to help people in kind of pastoral counseling, and what they're trying to do with that catalog of vices is to say, these are ways we're discovering a lot of people are getting hung up and are having difficulties in trying to live well. And so then they would try to give them practical wisdom about, well, if wrath or resentment is the one that you're dealing with, here are some things to try. Or if lust is the one you're dealing with, here are some things to try. And so again, it's that sort of, if this helps you, then it helps you. If it doesn't help you, that's fine. It doesn't help you, but it can really help a lot of folks there.
Yeah, it can. Another place I think it really helps is, Dallas is in the Bible Belt. And
I've heard that.
There are a lot of young adults to early 40s, I would say, who are ready to break with the tradition they grew up with or the faith tradition they grew up with. But out of respect for their parents, they don't know how to do that. And the Enneagram is a game changer in terms of communication, because somehow in its nature, you can use Enneagram numbers to have a conversation with somebody that you could never, ever get away with using their name. And the result of that is that there's a new common language that families can speak to work through different ways of looking at the world and different generational ideas and practices that don't land as judgmental or harsh, that give people room to make room for the other people in their family.
Could you give an example of a way you've seen that happen?
Sure. I believe that there are more 6s than any other number. And after 6s, I think 9s are the next greatest number. And what happens with 6s is that their passion is fear, but it's better named as anxiety because they are very concerned about possible future events. So if in any group we're in of 50 or more, there are more 6s than any other number potentially. And if the struggle they have in greeting the day and making life work is anxiety, and if they have to live in a culture that is anxious, as ours has been for a time, then, when I first started writing my last book, which was like, I don't know, now 2.5 years ago, I guess, I had been saying there is anger and anxiety falling on all of us everywhere. Unbidden. It's just falling on us. Well, if you're a 1 or a 6, that's a different problem than if you're a 2 or a 9. And so if you can understand that as a 19-year-old, that your grandmother is a 6, she doesn't know anything about the Enneagram. She doesn't know that there are 9 ways of seeing the world and processing information. She manages her anxiety with worst case scenario planning. And she has been attached to a belief system that says, if you don't go by the rules, you are in a lot of trouble. Then she just loves you by wanting you to go through with the belief system that she handed to you and by honoring all those rules. And 1 tends to be less impatient with somebody whose lens is fear, anxiety. And if that's not your own, then you think, what's wrong with you? There's no reason to believe that way. Why are you attached to that? Why can't you see my way of thinking? And as soon as you make room for fear and anxiety, then you can address it with kindness instead of judgment and impatience.
Mm.
And you can say, I think you're afraid of things that I'm not afraid of. And you worry about things that I'm not worried about. So you might follow that with, here's my question. My grandchildren call me Grams. So we'll go with, here's the question. You could say, Grams, do you think I'm a good human being? Do you think have been kind and mindful of others, and I have grown up well, and that I am going to make good decisions? And what grandmother is going to say? No, I don't think that. And then you say, well, maybe we just are on two paths headed to the same place. And maybe we can learn from each other. And I love you, and I don't want you to worry about me.
Yeah. So it provides a way to reframe what one is experiencing in another person that doesn't have to make it so personally felt or personally experienced.
Right. And it's not I'm right and you're wrong.
Yeah.
It's we're different.
You talk a lot about change and transformation. I saw in the road back to you this quote y'all had from Flannery O'Connor: "Accepting oneself does not preclude an attempt to become better," which I find that very helpful. Well, what are some kind of basic or major lessons you've learned in what facilitates or makes space for fruitful change in someone's life? What's kind of the precursor tilling of the soil, we might say, in a person before significant transformation or change can occur?
That's a big question. Well, I want to start with the word allow. I think that in the West and in the United States, we are kind of convinced that we're in charge, that we have our own destiny in our hands, and that we are in control. Control is my very favorite illusion, but it's still an illusion.
Yeah.
And I believe that change occurs when you take on something new. So I would, from our pre-show conversation, I would suggest that you changed in some ways of how you see when I taught you the Enneagram. And in the years since, it has been transformational in your relationship with other people. But all of that involves allowing. And so change is when you take on something new. Transformation occurs when something old falls away, usually beyond your control. So the key with Enneagram wisdom is that you learn, and it's very difficult, to observe yourself non-judgmentally. And the reason you have to be non-judgmental in self-observation is because as soon as you judge yourself, you defend yourself.
Right.
And that makes your personality bigger, not smaller. Which leads me to the reality that I teach people who they're not. I don't teach people who they are. I teach people about the covering, about the personality that they started to put on in childhood to make their way in the world. And there are transformational opportunities where you can, through life, recognize that you don't need to be protected in that exact way anymore. And you can allow that layer of your Enneagram personality to fall away. Because you just don't need it anymore.
Yeah.
And when you try to make it go away, your personality gets bigger, not less.
Yeah.
And underneath all of this personality is who you essentially are. My parents lived to be 92 and 89. And for whatever reason, they were highly evolved. And letting go of life was not difficult for them because they had learned to allow life to happen. My dad started practicing medicine before sulfa drugs. So imagine that. And he retired in 1987. So that's a long time of change that allowed transformative practices for people's lives. Maybe that's where they got it. But there was no clinging for them. And I watched them and I thought, that's what I want. I want to allow life to be what it is and unfold as it does. And I want to do good with my space in that time. And anything that helps me understand what I don't need makes my load a little lighter for the journey.
Yeah.
And so I've done a lot of things that changed me. But you know that thing where you go to a movie? Well, I guess people don't go to movies anymore, but you watch a movie and you think, oh, that movie is unbelievable. I'll never be the same. And then 2 months later, you want to tell somebody about it and you think, what is the name of that movie? That changed you forever, right?
Right.
Or the book you read, or the talk you heard, or the conversation you were part of, or the music you heard, or I think allowing things to come and go is essential. So the next thing is, well, great, I want transformation. So how do I get that? Well, you don't get it, but you don't waste an opportunity to experience it when it comes your way. My new book opens with a chapter on liminality. Liminal space is kind of a trendy thing to talk about for the last few years. I went back and through my old journals to find out when Father Richard Rohr talked to my husband Joe and me about liminal space the first time, and it was 19 years ago. And the thing about liminal space, according to the wisdom folks, all wisdom, not Enneagram wisdom folks, theologians and people I get to hear at times. The thing about liminal space is that it's the most teachable space. So we are coming out of 2 years of liminality. My question is, did we know to allow part of that to unfold? Or we were just trying to control every part of it the whole time? And did we know to ask the question, what am I learning? And I knew to ask the question, and I still got lost in it.
Yeah.
For months at a certain point, and didn't ask, what am I learning? What's here for me to learn? And I think if you don't understand the lens through which you see the world, then you're always trying to figure yourself out. And that takes a lot of energy.
Right.
That you then don't have to use in other ways, walking beside or in tandem with or in conversation with other people.
You're listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life. And we're most grateful to have you joining us. If you've not yet done so, subscribe today to the Tokens Podcast wherever you get your favorite podcasts. We do love hearing from you and are always pleased to hear some of the things you'd like to hear more about. Recently, we were very grateful to hear from Amos Allen, who wrote in response to our episode with Justin Barringer entitled The Business of War. Amos's message said, "While many interviews are informative and formative, listening to Justin was transformative. I don't know how to stop the Cheneys or Putins of the world, but I can be a friend. I can balance social justice efforts and reading with play, counseling, and rest. I think of Tokens podcasts as good trouble, thanks to all who produce good trouble via Tokens. And thank you, Amos, and thank you for that allusion to the great Honorable John Lewis. If you'd like to email us, you can do so at podcast@tokensshow.com. Also, remember you can sign up for our email list or find out how to join us for a live event, all at tokensshow.com. We do have a lineup of some fantastic events, concerts here in Nashville this year, and we'd be delighted if you'd come join us. This is our interview with Suzanne Stabile. Coming up, you'll hear more about how one might use the Enneagram to dispel one of the myths about willpower and bring about real, lasting transformation. Part 2 in just a moment. Welcome back to Tokens and our interview with Suzanne Stabile.
Let me go back to the first piece you pointed to there of the need to begin to observe oneself non-judgmentally. And that's been something that I've worked pretty hard on for myself. And I think that one of the initial inhibitions towards that practice for me was what I discovered in time is a false conviction, grounded more in shame. But I realized that I was afraid to observe myself non-judgmentally because I thought thereby I would perhaps give license to some illicit thing or desire in me. And I thought kind of by beating myself up more, I could in fact get better, which turned out to be a horrible strategy. But for whatever reason, that was kind of wired into me. But what's kind of some advice you would give on first steps or even advanced steps in learning to observe oneself in a non-judgmental fashion?
Well, I think the first thing you would have to live into is that willpower is a myth that's fueled by emotion, and it doesn't get you far. And it for sure doesn't get you far with any kind of internal work. Joe and I joined the YMCA in January every year for 5 years in a row because you could join for free for 3 months. And we didn't ever pay the money in April. Because in January, we were all whipped up about having time to go to the Y and do all the stuff. And then our lives started up again after the holidays, and we didn't have that time, and we didn't go, and we didn't do it. And I think that so let me give you an example. I don't know what part of your world that you have to have as perfect as you can get it, but I know there's one.
Yeah.
It may be more than one, but I know there's one. Yeah. All right. So if I said to you, okay, well, you need to not do that anymore. Just don't do that. Don't worry about that. Doesn't matter. It's good as everybody else. Guy down the street's closet looks like that. You're all good. You just leave it like it is. You can't do that. And if you try to use willpower to do it, you can't do that either. When I get really tired and feel like people don't love me and they don't appreciate me and all that stuff, I just kind of slide down the wall and cry and say, everybody takes me for granted and I'm done. I'm not going to give to people anymore. I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm just finished. And that doesn't last an hour for me because my way of seeing is whoever's right in front of me and whatever way I can do something to be helpful. And sometimes I do that for them. And sometimes I do that for me. Mm-hmm. And so the goal is to do it more often for them than for me. Right?
Right.
But then that involves discernment. Then I have to say, okay, why am I moving toward this person? Do I want something in return? And then I have to say, wonder if this other person wants my help. And then I have to ask, is it mine to do? Or is it somebody else's to do? And what do I have to say no to say yes to this? So if I observe myself kind of hovering above myself, it's my only angelic moments. So I take that idea. If I kind of do that and I say, look at there, Suzanne, you helped that person and you made them so uncomfortable because they didn't want your help. But I can't say, okay, I'm not helping people anymore. You can't say I'm not going to perfect this thing anymore because it's the lens through which you see. Now, here's another layer for you. All those things that you perfect are your intuitive way of managing your anger. And so if we rah-rah and are patronizing with you about trying to perfect those things, then you lose that way of managing anger. As I told you, Richard Rohr taught me the Enneagram a long time ago. He's a 1 on the Enneagram, as are you. And he says, when I think the world's going to hell, I clean my bathroom. Because I can't control the world. And in that moment, I feel like I desperately need to control something.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not saying that I know how to talk about this theologically, but I would say this. The Paschal mystery, which is what we as Christians live by in terms of an understanding of living, dying, and rising, for me happens 100 times a day. And it is in that awareness of I'm getting it right, I'm not getting it right, I get to try again, that I have been able to relax a little bit about life and discover my goodness.
You've worked, as I understand it, a fair amount in the Baylor healthcare system with both cancer and transplant patients. Is that correct?
No, staff.
Oh, staff. Okay. So there you have folks who I would imagine are dealing with very weighty, sometimes tragic, perhaps, engagements with life and death. What are things that you've learned about resilience or dealing with one's own stuff in the face of that sort of stress, potential stress or anxiety that you've noted in significant ways?
One of the foundational pieces of wisdom that I operate from is the work of Maurice Nicole, who was an Englishman who worked in the 40s and 50s. And he says that there are 3 centers of intelligence and that they are thinking, feeling, and doing. And that there are only 3. And one of the 3 defines our way of encountering the world first every time. So when you receive information from the environment, you, as a 1 on the Enneagram, respond first with what am I going to do? I respond first with what do I feel? And other personality types respond first with what do I think? And then Karen Horney, who was a great psychiatrist at the time, who did a lot of really good work, also wrote a paper and said, she's German-American, and she said, we all either move toward other people, away from other people, or against other people. So to not go too deep, but to try to answer your question with what I think is the best answer. The Enneagram is divided into 3 triads based on how you take in information. Is it with what I think, what do I feel, or what am I going to do? And then you add Karen Horney's work on top of that, and in each one of those triads, there's one personality type that moves away from other people, one that moves toward, and one that moves against. So the first thing is that kind of makes you think, okay, well, if you take the Enneagram and then you apply another theory on top of that and it fits, and then you apply another theory on top of that and it fits, and they were not Enneagram people, then you have another way of thinking, there must be something here then. But what happens that I think is most important in hospital work happens in that while one of those 3 centers is dominant and one supports the dominant, one is repressed. So there are 3 personality types that are feeling repressed, 3 that are doing repressed, and 3 that are thinking repressed. And I don't have time to talk about that in this sitting with you, but I would say that that's where the magic is in Enneagram work, but you got to do other work to get there. And the reason I'm saying that is because if you learn to bring up your repressed center, then you approach life with more balance, because each of those centers of intelligence needs to be used for its purpose. So I can work with hospital chaplains for a day and a half if they've had some Enneagram background, and for 2.5 days, I can give them the background. And I can help them in the first 2 visits with a patient know pretty much 95% of the time whether or not the person is feeling repressed, thinking repressed, or doing repressed. And once they know that, then they understand Enneagram stances, and then they understand how to approach those 3 different groups of people in the way that's the most helpful to the patient.
Got a new friend here in Nashville who loves the Episcopal prayer book, and he was telling me recently about how it hit him after some years of, I think he said it's the prayer for blessing at table that says something like, make us mindful of the needs of others. And he's a big Enneagram fan himself, and he said that he started paying more attention to that, and even thinking through, if I can have some idea of what other people's needs are through something like the Enneagram, then it allows me to be truly of more help to people. And
Sure.
a way to kind of answer my prayers. So I hear that same sort of approach there in what you're describing of, and again, that's a very, going back to the classic virtue of prudence, that requires us to pay attention to all the complexities of any sort of decision. It's a sort of prudential judgment, and it's saying what I know in this particular circumstance with this particular person at this particular time, what might be most helpful to them.
Exactly.
So again, it's a very complex set of commitments there. Yeah, lovely.
But very doable. Very doable. My daughter, my oldest daughter, is an 8 on the Enneagram, so she's fairly aggressive. And she called me one morning. She now teaches all over the country Enneagram. But when she was learning, I don't know, maybe it's been 10 years ago now, she called me and said, Mom, I don't really think the golden rule applies to 8s. And I said, what? She said, I don't think the golden rule applies to 8s. I treat everybody exactly like I want to be treated. And it just usually doesn't go well. And since that moment, I have been saying that one of the things the Enneagram offers us is a way to treat other people the way they want to be treated.
Right.
And not the way that we want to be treated.
Yes. Yeah.
And those are very different ways.
The subtitle of your third book, Enneagram Wisdom for Stress, Balance, and Transformation. And obviously, we continue to be in a time of great stress in various ways. And harkening back to something you said earlier about kind of how palpable anger is in our culture. I've talked with a couple of colleagues here recently and with my wife about how I've noticed of late that my anger that I have had generally stays, as you said, kind of directed at myself mostly. But I've noticed lately that it really caught my attention probably in the last month. I hung up, I had this phone conversation, and a colleague had called me, and they had mentioned another colleague of ours. And I hung the phone up, and I was outside on my deck, and I hung the phone up, and I said, I hate, and I called the other colleague's name. And it just took me aback because I thought, I don't talk that way. That's not the way I talk and react to the world. Mm-hmm. And I find, I find that very unacceptable in myself. But then I started noticing how more and more and more, I'm noticing how this sharp feelings of anger and frustration are coming out. So then I was talking to another colleague about that, and they said, well, she said, maybe this is just a lot of us are experiencing a lot more anger because of the immense stress that we're experiencing in our culture. But I guess one, observations about that, and two, wisdom on dealing with those realities.
I think we overuse the word anger. And I hate to say this to you because I don't want you to use this as an excuse to not say you're angry when you're angry, because you need to. That's what you need to do. You need to claim anger in real time. But we tend to use the word anger for frustration, fear, anxiety, being misunderstood, loss. And I don't think those words don't mean the same thing. And I don't think that we're really that angry. I think we're afraid. And I think we're afraid because we have been allowed to live with the illusion that we have more control than we have. And I think some people are resentful or frustrated or afraid because they don't know if they're going to have a job after COVID. And, you know, we are all moving so quickly. When people say, how you doing? They don't mean how you doing. They mean hi.
Right.
And I'm imagining, because I know some of the people, I love some of the people that you love and who love you. And I'm guessing that you get to sit down with a group of people and talk about the deeper things of life pretty much when you want to. But what about people who don't get to do that? And what about people for whom everything is input? You know, as a 2 on the Enneagram, I'm a verbal processor. I can't think things through. I'm thinking repressed. I have to verbally say things to understand them for myself. You know how many people want to hear me verbally process? Not many.
Yeah.
I'm married to a 9 on the Enneagram, and, you know, they only hear 2/3 of what's happening. So he happily listens, and I know he's not getting all of it. So I think the first thing I would say is we're overusing the word anger. The second thing I would say is I just don't think we're as safe as we thought we were. In a micro way and in a macro way. I think it didn't occur to us that a pandemic would happen in our lifetime. The things that are happening worldwide right now didn't occur to us. And so I think we don't feel ready. And we take out that frustration on whatever's right in front of us. And this is one of the most important things I'm going to say as far as I'm concerned. I've been teaching people for a long, long time. And everybody I've ever met wants at least these 2 things. They want to belong, and they want their life to have meaning. And both things are up for grabs right now. Belonging is awfully hard for some people to experience. And, you know, if you just line up, if there are 2 choices of lines to get in and they oppose one another, then you can line up on either side and belong. And I think people have sold out for that kind of belonging instead of for a deeper belonging because of a need that we've not met in another way. I don't know how children are going to come out of this time, but I'm not sure they're going to come out feeling like they can be anything they want to be and become anybody they want to become. I don't know that we'll ever see a time, we won't in my lifetime, where there are all these avenues and possibilities for everybody to do something meaningful with their life. And I think we have to be careful that we don't start saying, well, this has meaning and this doesn't. Whatever is ours to do is meaningful, and we need to be given an opportunity to do it. And dividing into camps doesn't give us that opportunity. And so I am hoping, and as a Christian praying, for a little more space that is non-dualistic. What if our goal for a month was, I'm going to try to see everything as both that could be true and that could be true, instead of either that's true and that's not. Either it's right or it's wrong. Either it's good or it's bad. And that takes some reprogramming to do. I started watching myself, I see a color I don't like. I see a car I don't like. I see a dress I don't like. I see an opportunity for soup this morning on the news, on the commercial. And I just said, oh, I would hate that. And it's like, I've never tasted it. I don't know if I would hate it. And why am I talking about hating soup? Right? It's so comfortable to just see everything dualistically.
We get close to our conclusion here. Closing words of encouragement or suggestions about how to explore more or lean into, as you said earlier, acceptance of the possibility of change in ourselves?
There's a story that Jack Kornfield tells at the beginning of the book, The Wise Heart, about a group of Tibetan monks who had been caring for this huge, big statue of Buddha. It was a big clay statue, and when it would get, and it had lived and been all right and been patched and managed and handled through war and weather and all kinds of things for hundreds of years. But when it would get really hot and there wasn't much rain or moisture, it would crack and they would patch it. And one day one of the monks saw this big crack. And like a young monk would do, he went and got a flashlight because the crack was big enough that he thought he could see what was inside. And using the flashlight, he could see, and what shone back at him was pure, brilliant gold. And they took all of the clay off of the Buddha and found the largest, most beautiful golden Buddha in the world. And the thing that I would say is that I think that we have put on layers and layers and layers of protective gear. In Enneagram language, we call it layers of personality. And underneath all of those layers is the pure beauty of who we each are. And I'm trying to live these days remembering that underneath all the protection that I see on other people is this pure, beautiful, wonderful human being. And that the same is true underneath me. And if that's too heavy, then I've got a littler one that you can work with. I tore my distal bicep tendon right before Thanksgiving. And it's a very unusual injury. It's usually your radial bicep tendon, and it's a 4 to 6 month recovery. And it's tricky. So I was in a sling for a while, and now I'm toward the end of the 3rd month, and I'm wearing a brace that nobody else can see, but you can. If I wear this brace forever, I'll never get back full use of this arm. But if I hadn't put it on in the beginning, then I also would have never had full recovery from the injury. And so I don't want people to think that all this clay covering is bad. It was necessary. But what about if it's not necessary now?
Yeah.
And you have to allow it to fall away. You can't make it go away. And that's my hope.
Been talking to Suzanne Stabile, Enneagram Master Teacher, author of The Journey Toward Wholeness, Enneagram Wisdom for Stress, Balance, and Transformation. Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's been a delight to be with you today.
Thank you, Lee. It's been a delight for me, too.
You've been listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, The Good Life. If you'd like to hear more about the Enneagram, you can check out our Season 1 interview with Suzanne's co-author of The Road Back to You, Ian Cron. Remember, you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, CastBox, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And we'd be most delighted if you'd go over there and give us one of those glowing 5-star reviews, because it helps other people find our podcast. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this podcast possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Ashley Bain, Tom Anderson, Carrie Harmon. Music beds by Zach and Maggie White and Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening, and peace be unto thee. The Tokens Podcast is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.